this webinar today, and we're going to be splitting the time between us. Got myself, Joseph Hubbard, we have our International Director, John Mackay, and we also have our resident medical biologist, Dr. Diane Eager, with us as well. For more
talk about adaptation, which is one of three processes which the evolutionists insist will produce evolution. So let's have a look at what these actually are, because they are real processes. But will they produce evolution? Just like climate change is real, but is it the sort of problem that's being touted in the media? So let's have a look at adaptation, and let's go to, this is from a university website of a general biology course, all about adaptation. The rather fanciful title there refers to a little creature called a thorny devil. Now, how often have you seen on some wildlife program about extreme climates like deserts or polar regions, and the presenter will say, oh, this little creature is so well adapted to living in this place? Well, let's have a look at this particular little creature that's supposedly well adapted, right? This little creature is called Moloch horridus. Now, if ever a little creature was burdened with a terrible name, this certainly is it. Moloch was one of the worst pagan gods that was ever invented, I think. Its common name is the thorny devil, but they are actually cute little fellas that they're not going to be any danger to anybody at the moment. In fact, I took that photo. That's not my hand, but I could have held it in my hand. They're quite cute little fellas. Now, what is it that they have that the adaptation article says that they are so well adapted to living in the desert? Well, they have very small jaws and teeth, and they live on ants. And so their small jaws and teeth are just the right size and shape for eating ants and crunching them up and swallowing them. But they have a really intriguing skin. And this is where all of those excrescences and that knobbly surface is for. It actually conducts water. And they can extract water from shallow puddles and wet sand. So in fact, they can go and stand in some wet sand and they will get a drink. Now, I do apologize for some of the glitches here. I have a bit of a problem with this computer and its screen. So that last sentence should say extract water from shallow puddles and wet sand. So it can go and stand in a puddle and get a drink. That's pretty clever, actually. Now, the way they do this is they have all of these fine scales like little plates on their skin, and in between those are grooves, and they are just the right size and arranged in such a way that any water that flows into these grooves will flow towards the animal's mouth, and it just needs to make movements with its mouth and its small jaws, and the water will just flow into its mouth. Isn't that brilliant? That really is quite amazing. And this is the standard story that you get about thorny devils. A lot of research has gone into them lately. And this was from a story from the Science News on the ABC. That's the Australian broadcasting equivalent of the BBC. And this was their story. Thorny devils simply can't lick up water from puddles or drops of condensation because their entire mouth, including their jaw and tongue, has evolved specifically to feed on small ants that share their habitat. Now that's interesting. And the story goes on, so this lizard has evolved a bizarre alternative to drinking with its mouth. Capillary channels on its skin squeeze every last drop of moisture out of the arid landscape and push it towards the animal's mouth. Now, interesting story there. This animal somehow shrunk its mouth and its jaws in order to eat ants, so it had to find another way of drinking water. So it evolved this amazing skin with these extraordinary channels. And in fact, scientists are studying these to see if they can design devices that will actually channel just very small amounts of water or fluid, which is a useful function actually in some scientific research and laboratory techniques. Now, I think there's a question we should ask here. It's always good to sort of stand back and just think of a few common sense things like, how many half-evolved thorny devils died of dehydration while they waited to get that water system right? Because it does involve quite an elaborate structure with all of the scales and getting the capillary channels to be just the right size and getting them arranged so that the water is conducted in the right direction. In fact, this is a really cleverly designed animal. So what these so-called adaptations are really design features. It has small jaws and teeth, that's fine. That's quite suitable for eating ants, but also for eating other small items like small seeds or small bits of plant matter or pollen grains or things like that. Keep that in mind. We might come back to that later on in the questions. Now, the water conducting skin really is brilliant. It extracts water from shallow puddles and wet sand. And as I said, scientists are studying this with the aim of replicating it so that they can use it in some scientific and microengineering techniques. It's really brilliant. It is a really good design feature. However, I did say that adaptation was a real process. So what actually is adaptation? Now, here is another thing that we need to do. Don't let anyone try and bluff you with any so-called technical language. A lot of this language is just plain English. So just think, what does the word adapt or the word adaptation just mean as a plain English word? Right? Use your common sense. It's a God-given gift. So if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary and look up adapt, it says to make something suitable for a new use or purpose, or to modify, or to become adjusted to new conditions. Now notice, adaptation or adapting does not make something that didn't exist before. What it does is modify something that already exists. So it's not going to make something new. So adaptation is the ability to adjust in response to changes in the environment or to respond to changes in activity. And that is actually one of the things that distinguishes living things from non-living things, is to be able to do this. But it is a design feature, because in order to do that, for a start, you need some way of detecting the change that's happened, whether it's a change in the environment outside or a change in the activity of the particular living thing, and then a way of starting up the process of modifying the function or the structure, and then it is going to be limited. It's not going to invent any new structures that didn't exist. It's just going to be a bit of fine-tuning. So it's a real process. It's a useful process. In fact, it's an essential process for all living things. So let's have a look at a real example. Now, we've looked at lizard skin, so let's look at human skin. And no, you can't stand on some wet sand and get a drink. However, I live in Canberra, which is not near the coast, but I like to go to the coast, and I love to walk on the wet sand at the edge of the waves. Isn't that lovely if you ever get a chance to do that? If you live in a warm place like Australia, Joseph, I don't suggest you try this in Iceland. And one of the nice things about that is the sensation of walking on soft sand and the sensation of the water. Skin has two functions. One is to protect our inside tissues from the outside world so that we don't dehydrate and just form a physical barrier. And the other is as a sensory organ where we have a lot of nerve endings in our skin that tell us about the outside world, but we also use those in our movement, in our walking. So the skin in your feet is constantly sending information back to your brain that is processed. There are lots of quick reflexes that we're not conscious of that we need to be able to walk efficiently. But sometimes we do get to walk on places that are not quite so nice as walking on the nice beach sand. And our skin may not be quite tough enough to be able to cope with walking on things like sharp rocks. And it could easily be damaged. And in fact, that's why we normally put shoes on. But when you put shoes on, you do decrease the amount of sensation that you get from the ground underneath you and from the skin on your feet. And we know that that does make some shoes are very awkward to walk in, and walking is not as efficient, particularly with some of the modern fashion shoes. But so we have a bit of a trade-off that we need here, and there is a real adaptation. Hard surfaces can cause damage to the skin, but the skin has a built-in adaptation for that. We have a solution. The skin will then make a thick, tough layer, and you know this as a callus. So if you habitually walk outside on hard ground, the skin on your feet will get thicker and harder and be quite an effective protective layer. But there is that potential problem. If you have a hard, thick layer at the bottom of your feet under in your skin, there might be a problem with loss of sensation. And so some scientists decided that they would actually test this recently. And notice how they were thinking with this evolutionary mindset. Because, this is what they wrote in their report, because calluses, that's the thickened, hardened areas of the epidermal layer of skin, that's the outer layer, right? This is the evolutionary solution to protecting the foot, right? We wondered whether they differ from shoes, whether the calluses differ from shoes, right, in maintaining tactile sensitivity. In other words, the sense of touch when you are walking. So they actually did some interesting experiments with people who habitually walk outside in bare feet and have quite thick calloused skin. And this is what they found. In contrast to shoes, callus thickness does not trade off protection as measured in hardness and stiffness. In other words, the callus was effective in terms of being a hard, stiff layer. And that doesn't give you a trade-off for the ability to perceive tactile stimuli at frequencies experienced during walking. They actually got people and tickled their feet and vibrated them. Wouldn't you have liked to have been a subject to that experiment? Have someone tickling feet and apply a vibrator to it? But anyway, this is what they found. So here we have a real example of adaptation. When you walk on soft surfaces, the extra thick layers are not needed, and your skin is soft and sensitive, and you can go walking on the beach and enjoy the sensation of the soft sand and the water around you. If you habitually walk on hard surfaces, the skin builds up extra layers for protection. But really clever, the sensitivity is maintained. It's better than shoes. And we shouldn't be surprised about that, because God invented feet, we invented shoes. However, don't throw your shoes away, because we live in a world that is not particularly nice all the time, right? Adam and Eve were naked, they walked around in bare feet, but they had a beautiful, pristine environment to walk with nothing corrupted. We now walk in a much harsher environment, so shoes are clever and are needed sometimes. Now, that reminds us about our little creature who's living out in a harsh environment because of the fallen world that we live in. If thorny devils didn't adapt to live in the Australian desert, and as we looked, these so-called adaptations are actually design features. So was it designed to live there? Well, if the world was very good in the first place, there wouldn't have been places that were so dry and so hot as the Australian desert, where a lot of things can't live. Well, if this wasn't designed to live in the Australian desert, what is it doing there? Well, we will answer that question in the next session. If you are interested in those two studies that I just quoted from, they were written up in the newsletter that Joseph mentioned, and we archive all of those items so that if you haven't been getting the newsletter, you can go back and look in the archive. Just go to the fact file. It has its own separate website, creationfactfile.com, and you can search that. Just do a keyword search and look for all of those things. But do sign up for the newsletter. We trawl the normal scientific news that gets put out there with claims of, here we've got wonderful evidence of evolution, and we just help people to see how they can look at these real scientific discoveries and discern what was actually discovered and what's the story that's being told about them, and is the story true? If you do have any questions about any of them, you can send them to our other website, our question and answer website, askjohnmackay.com.